Hello, this is Photography Gamer. Welcome back to the channel. Firstly, I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone who watched and gave me some feedback on the first virtual photography guide video on Horizon Zero Dawn. So in today's episode, I'm going to be looking at another photo mode, and that one is God of War. So I'm going to break down all the functions available to you. After this, I'm going to focus on this episode's special topic, which is framing and composition. And I will wrap up the video with some questions I've received from the virtual photography community, and I will do my best to answer those to help you out. Okay, God of War photo mode. Firstly, before I get into the functions, I would say it's a good photo mode overall. It's a beautiful, beautiful game to look at, first and foremost. Amazing, amazing level of detail on the characters. Obviously, it's not an open world game. There are sections that have a kind of a broad open space, but generally it's kind of narrow, so it's not like photo mode in open world games, which have a bit more expansive space for you to take pictures in, but there's still a lot of beauty in this game, and I'm just going to break down for you now the functionality that's available to you. Okay, so the basic functions, obviously you've got L2 and R2. They use the crane of the camera, so you can raise the camera and lower the camera. So that's good for perspective, depending on when you want to do like a top-down aerial shot or a low to high. Generally, low to high creates a sort of epic sense if you're photographing people. High to low, it gives more of a panoramic landscape atmosphere. And when you're ready to take your picture, if you press X, the interface will be hidden, or if you like to compose the image without the interface there, you can use X for that. That's the basic functions. Okay, so the first menu screen, we have field of view, focal length, and camera roll. So field of view and focal length, they're really, you can think of them as a zooming mechanism. And field of view and focal length in God of War work in conjunction, as in if you slide one of them, the other one will slide as well. You know, you can move one and move the other, but they are working in conjunction. I use field of view mainly to get into a tight shot. If I want to do a nice close-up portrait of a character, I would put the field of view very narrow. Depends on what you're doing, depends whether it suits your style, but that's what that does. Camera roll is the next one. Now, camera roll, basically you can tilt the image. Now, tilting the image, depending on what, like the general rule, it's not a rule, but it's something I apply to what I do, is if there's movement or action in my shot, I like to add a bit of camera roll because it creates a sense of like the camera's moving with the action. So slanting it to one side or the other will add a kind of a dynamic feel. But you can also use camera roll in a different way. Like if you have a kind of an eerie, surreal image and you want to create something that kind of distorts it and makes it look a bit weirder, having a slant on the image can kind of create a kind of an eerie quality to it, depending on the image, obviously. Okay, next screen, depth of field, focus distance, f-stops. So the game has a depth of field. You can focus on Kratos and Atreus, which is great, so it saves a lot of time. Or you can set up a custom focus, depending on what you want. So the focus distance dictates how far away from you the focus point is going to be, and then the f-stop dictates how kind of much depth that area is. Like, is it just going to be enough depth to focus on a very small object, or is it going to be everything in the like a sort of 10 meter rate like distance? So focus distance, what you're going to focus on, and the f-stop is really a choice depending on what you're taking a picture of. If you're taking a picture of a landscape, you probably want to have a high f-stop because then you'll get everything in the environment in focus. If you want to just focus on Kratos, for example, and you want everything else to be really blurry, you set the focus distance to Kratos and then you put the f-stop as low as you can, and you know it will be very blurry, misty and mysterious. So it's really a style choice depending on what you want to emphasize. Okay, next screen we have film grain. Now I do like adding a bit of grain to the images because it gives it a bit of texture and depth. I know some people are scared of grain because they want it to be super smooth, 4K, just sleek, but grain is interesting in photography because it gives a sense of detail, depth, texture. But if you want to just add a little bit of texture, if it's too smooth and you want to just give it a bit of grittiness, add a bit of grain to the image. Okay, then we've got the exposure. This is, you know, you don't have brightness and lights, darks, blacks, whites to deal with in this kind of edit function. So exposure is kind of really bright or dark elements. So like I use the exposure just to bump the overall brightness up. You don't want to go too far. It depends on what you're doing. Again, it's really each image is a individual moment, so you have to treat each image as a special case. You can't just apply the same principles of editing to every picture because all pictures are different. So you have to think about, what are you doing? If you're in a place and it's very dark and it's a bit too gloomy and you can't see the characters that well, bump a little bit of exposure in there, or if it's too bright, again, you just tweak it. Now, exposure is a good thing to use in conjunction with filters because some of the filters are a bit heavy-handed. So you can add the filters, which have a variety of different colors and effects. Then you can just use the filter intensity to slide back and forth if you want 100% of the filter, or you just want like 20% of it. So like, you know, if there's a filter you like but you don't want it to be so bold, just put 25% or something of the filter on, maybe raise the exposure a bit, and then you can kind of just play around with those three things and compensate. Next one, we have vignettes and borders and logos. So vignettes, if you don't know what a vignette is, it's a border on the image, and the idea of a vignette is to focus the viewer's attention to the center of the image because it basically darkens the border from very dark around the edges to progressively less dark until we get to the center where it's just the normal image. And then you can play around with the intensity and the fall off to see how severe you want that to be. Now, this is a very good vignette compared to other games. Some vignettes in some games just really aren't fit for purpose. This goes really dark. Then you've got the borders and the logos. So the borders, you know, if you want to create kind of like a cinematic widescreen type shot or just various different options, you've got a few here. And the logo as well, if you want to create like a poster, advertising, or if you're a YouTuber and you've got a review, you're taking a photo and you want that to be your cover, your thumbnail. If you don't want to have to look up the logo online, here you can just put it on there wherever you want to do it. So that's a good option to have. And finally, on the final edit screen, you've got Kratos, Atreus, other characters, Kratos' face and Atreus' face. So basically you can remove Kratos, Atreus or other characters from the shot because you might not want the enemies in the shot. You might not want Atreus, you might not want Kratos. You might just want to focus on one of the characters or one of the things in the image. So it's a nice option to have to be able to remove them. And then you have the faces. Now this is one of my personal favourite features of God of War. Quite often the faces they do in these edit modes for photo modes are awful. These ones are brilliant, like they're hilarious. And like here are just some options with Kratos, and most of them are just comedy, but you do have some ones where he's shouting. So if you're in a real intense action moment, having him, like I think it's the last one on the list, that's really intense. Then you've got Atreus. Atreus has got kind of similar ones, but you can play around with the two. Like you can have some nice kind of heartwarming combinations of the two, or comedy. So like they're good options to have, and they just give you another thing to play around with to create a nice image. So that's God of War's photo mode. It's a pretty decent mode. I mean, the game itself, I think it's good for taking pictures of portraits and action. I would say that's the preference. Landscapes and more kind of wider, broad shots, you can get them in the mountains in some of the locations, but it's not quite the freedom you would get in an open world game. But the game is so rich and detailed with the armor, the weapons, the character models, that it's really good for those kind of people shots, action shots, portraits, things like that. In terms of functionality, I think it's got enough there. Maybe it could have done with a little bit more post-processing options, and I think it would have been nice if you could have zoomed out a little bit more. But I guess the whole game is quite linear, so because it's not open world, you don't have that broadness of space. As a photo mode, I'd probably give it like an 8.75 out of 10. The reason it's probably not a 9 is because it is a linear experience generally, and it doesn't have that big expansive open world all around. So you have a bit of a restriction, but it's got more detail than a lot of other games. More texture, more kind of small intricate details and real colour and vibrance. Lots of cool architecture, armour, weapons. But yeah, I'd say 8.75 is a fair rating for the photo mode. Okay, so that's God of War. So the special topic for this episode, framing and composition. So the key point of framing and composition really is what is the focal point of your image? You know, what are you taking the picture of? Is it of a person? Is it a landscape? Is it a kind of an action scene? That's the key. So figuring out what it is you're taking the picture of, that's the first thing. But then how you frame it, how you compose it, will dictate how it looks, how it feels. And you can frame and compose an image in multiple different ways depending on where you place the camera and how you place the camera. So the focal point, that's the key. So if it's a person, okay, you have to frame the person and think about how you want to frame them. Do you want to frame them centrally? Do you want to frame them to the side? Is it landscape? Is it portrait orientation? What do you want in the background? How do you want them, do you want them looking at the camera or off camera? One thing I do is I like to have a grid up on the screen if the game allows it. Some don't, but the way I look at an image is I break it down into kind of 9 squares. So you have like thirds. So I rarely put my subject, whether it's a person or an object, in the center, because unless it's a symmetrical image, unless there's some kind of architectural symmetry that I'm zoning through. If it's a person or a scene, I like to have the focal point to one side, to the left or the right. And then the other side of the image, you have some kind of context where they are, the location, or some kind of thing that leads you in to the image of what's going on. And this is where you can also apply a diagonal line. So like sometimes I would put my subject in the bottom left or the bottom right. And then at the top side of the other side of the image, you would have a focal point, so it's almost like a visual journey. So there at the bottom corner, and then at the top corner on the other side is where they're heading. So it kind of creates like a visual journey. That's almost like travel photography. And I think with framing and composition, I think what I would do is, the key to making the image as good as it can be is eliminating any waste. What I mean by waste is, when you look at an image and you're framing something, there is something you're trying to put across, whatever it is, whether it's a person, a moment, a feeling, whatever that may be. So what you've got to do is, that's the main focus. So that's what you want to compose and frame. So you need to frame it in a way that's going to accentuate that moment to the absolute maximum. So if there's other things in the image that are distracting your eye, maybe you need to kind of crop it a bit or reframe it. The best images I find are the images that are very succinct and clear, like you have the focal point and you're drawn to it, and there isn't a whole lot of other clutter that's kind of taking your eyes away from the focal point. So when I say waste and refining the position, what I really mean is just trying to eliminate things that are going to detract from the feeling and the overall impact of your image. So have a look around the image. Is there a lot of dead space? Do you need it there? Do you need that kind of awkward looking object that's kind of standing out in the corner? Think about the little details, because the little details can sometimes detract from the overall feel. And framing and composition can change that. You can always cut in, change the angle a little bit, or just recompose it. And finally, on framing and composition, I'm on screen right now. This is a photo that I took yesterday. So I basically just went to an area that looked quite interesting and I paused the game. I didn't particularly have a photo in mind. So what you're watching right now is me taking a bunch of different photographs. Now, here we just have it's Kratos in a very colourful environment, and you could do a nice head and shoulders shot, you could do a upper body shot, you can do low to high, but the background, for the purpose of these photos, I'm going to use a very low f-stop to wash out the background, because I think that the colours will create a nice dreamy effect. And then really it's just about moving the camera around and trying it in different positions, and different positions will give a different feeling. There's lots of different options here, and this is one of the things I would say when you're taking pictures. You might have one picture in mind. Once you've taken it and you've finished it and it's ready to roll and you want to get back in the game, maybe have another look. Move the camera around a bit, because you might have another shot there that's completely different in terms of the framing and the composition. You may not have even thought about it. So it's always good to just have another look, because sometimes there's other images in there that you maybe wouldn't find unless you had another little play around. But yeah, as you can see here, very colourful environment, different perspectives, different angles. It's amazing what you can create if you just play around with it. Right, we're nearly done, so we're going to finish with some questions and answers. Thank you to everyone who sent me questions on Twitter. I've got 5 to answer today, so hopefully I can give you some insight and help you out with your virtual photography. Okay, first question. I love photography, but I'm never sure what makes a good portrait. Do you have any tips? Well, portrait photography is something I've done for a number of years. What makes a good portrait? Well, a portrait really, it's not just a picture of a person, it's a picture of a person that expresses something about them. So, in the case of let's talk about God of War, for example, Kratos is a very kind of boisterous and kind of powerful warrior. He's a fighter, he's a god, he's this kind of epic figure. So if I was framing a portrait of Kratos, I'd want him maybe with his weapon, with some ferocious kind of facial expression, maybe during combat or something like that. Because a portrait, it's not just a photocopy, it's trying to capture the essence of the character. In terms of tips, I would say, yeah, think about the character and who they are and what you want to say about them. That's one thing. Secondly, there's different types of portraits. You've got candid portraits and you've got more eyes to camera portraits. Now, what's the difference? Well, when the eye is to the camera, it's a lot more intense, it's a lot more intimate, so it feels like a deep connection between the photographer and the subject. So it's a lot more of a kind of a engaging photograph. So it's more, not confrontational, but it has more of an intensity. If you want to take a portrait that is a little bit more of a story, telling a story about a moment, like a kind of a documentary type portrait, eyes off camera, like candid portraits, I find possibly some of the most engaging, because it makes you think, what's going on here? Who is this person? Why are they there? What are they looking at? What's the kind of the story beyond the image? So that's good. If you candid portraits have a kind of a story element. Eyes to camera portraits are more kind of like intense. Okay, next question. I keep entering photo competitions, but I never win. What am I doing wrong? Well, you may not be doing anything wrong, because the thing is, a competition is a thing run by a person, and people have preferences, so everyone likes different things. So the people judging the competitions might have a specific type of thing they enjoy, so they're going to be looking for those things. So if you want to win a competition, there's two things I would say that would help. Understand who the judges are. So if you can have an understanding of the judges and what they like, the things that they generally seem to gravitate towards, and they like to comment on these types of images, like if you can know what they're looking for, that's a good start. Also, when they launch the competition, really pay attention to what they're saying in terms of what is the competition about. Like, it's about a certain game or a certain theme. Be very mindful of the theme, because that's the key. It's very easy to take a photograph and think you're covering the theme, but you're actually kind of going off on a tangent. Try and stay very focused on what the competition is about and hit as many of those points as you can, and also try and do it that's something in tune with how the previous competition winners have looked or what the judges tend to go for. That doesn't guarantee you're going to win, but these are little details that it's good to pay attention to, because it's kind of tailoring the photo to the competition, which is probably a good way of trying to get better results. Okay, next question. I've been experimenting with black and white filters and was wondering if you have any general advice for black and white pics. Well, black and white, it's a different medium. Like black and white photos, they're not just taking the color out. A lot of people desaturate an image and then say this is black and white, and technically that's correct, but black and white photography requires a different type of editing, because when you take colour out, you've just got shades. You've got light shades and dark shades, and the good thing about black and white photography is that it gives you more of an extreme option in terms of contrast. You can go very big on the light and very big on the dark, so you can have a real wide contrast range. So think about that when you're taking the picture, because like for me, good black and white pictures, they're kind of simple in a way, because they just deal with light and dark. So like if you have images that are very, very busy with lots of stuff in it, sometimes it's a bit difficult to make a good black and white shot. Like silhouettes are a good example. Silhouettes in black and white are great. Eerie trees, things like that. But like in terms of experimenting with black and white filters, when you put a black and white filter on, maybe raise the contrast, raise the exposure or things like that, or add a heavy vignette. Vignettes are very good for black and white photography because they can really isolate something. So maybe try that. Really, it's just practice with black and white photos. It's a kind of interesting medium. It's something you just need to find your own style with. But yeah, try be a bit more extreme with the editing. Don't just take the color out and think that's it. Add some exposure, add some contrast, use a vignette. A heavy vignette maybe, if you really want to create some interesting contrast. Okay, 2 more questions. Do you think virtual photography can help improve my real life photography? Well, yes and no. I think if you're using photo modes like the one in Red Dead 2, where you have like a real life camera and it's real time, you can't pause, you can't like move things around like it's on a drone. That I think will help your real life photography, because you have to be patient, you have to use light that's available, and the world keeps moving around you as it does in real life. So photo modes like Red Dead 2's original mode, I'd say is a very, very good mode if you want to improve real life photography, because the principles are the same. In terms of virtual photography, in terms of like traditional photo modes where you pause time, change the time of day, I'd say they can help you with composition and framing, but they won't help you with timing, because real life, everything's happening live, so you've got to be quick. You don't have 15 minutes to move the camera around, you've got to be sharp. Red Dead 2 original mode is good if you want to improve your timing, but the other modes are good for like post-processing, editing and stuff. So in a way, both can help, yes. Okay, final question. If you could design the perfect photo mode, what would it include and why? Well, I think it would include more options, like Days Gone's a good example. That has an abundance of options in terms of dealing with lights, darks, black, white, exposure, contrast. You'd want clarity and sharpness options. You'd want a lot of vignetting options. You'd want luminous options, so you could change the brightness and the darkness of each individual color. You'd want color sliders, so if you wanted to strip one color out of the image, you could take that out. You'd probably want a more advanced split toning option, lots more filters, because I think there's so many more filters they could add. Things like that. I don't think there's a perfect photo mode, but I think in future consoles might just create a unique photo mode that's integrated into the console rather than the game, because I think it would just help every gamer who wants to take pictures, because they're all very different. And if you had a standardized system, I think it would make the whole process less painful for everybody and people could get better at it quicker. So that's my hope, that they're going to make a fully comprehensive in-depth photo mode, maybe with a beginner mode and an advanced mode, much like in Days Gone, but even more functionality than that. Okay, thank you for those questions. If you would like to send me questions for the next episode, you can contact me on Twitter, details on the screen at the moment. So that was the episode, God of War, a very good photo mode, a bit of framing and composition advice and some Q&A. I hope that's been helpful. I hope these videos are proving to be useful for people. Photography is a personal thing for me, it's a personal thing for everybody, and I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm just here to share my experience of over 10 to 15 years of real life photography, give you some advice and tips on various things, and you can take and leave whatever you want from these videos and apply them to your work. And if they help in some way, then I'll be delighted with that. So please let me know if they help. Comment with some suggestions of other games that you'd like covered, and I'll work on the next episode soon. I don't know what game that's going to be, but I will decide that in the next week. Okay, so that's the episode wrapped up. I hope it's been useful. Thank you for watching. This is Photography Gamer signing off. Thank you.